Hi, here is Marila Hushcha from the International Institute for Peace. This is the next episode of Peace Matters, a podcast about contemporary conflicts in Europe and the world, and how to solve them. Our topic today is Belarus. We discuss how the country changed since the protests of 2020, the nature of the Belarusian authoritarianism, the meaning of the war with Ukraine, and Belarusian identity. My guests are Alexei Kazharski, researcher and lecturer at Charles University in Prague, and Artyom Shraibman, non-resident scholar at Carnegie Eurasia Russia Center and founder of Sense Analytics. So we speak about Belarus today. It's in the EU, it's a relatively under-discussed country, I would say, due to media attention moving to different conflicts and crises. Lots of them have been happening lately. The Belarusian case went down a bit in the media space, but it's still present, it's still affecting the people who live in this country and also people who don't live in this country any longer. So we're going to cover a little bit more the situation there and offer some sort of broader look of what it means for the EU, for the regional security in Europe, and offer maybe some sort of a longer-term vision for what can happen in future. So I would like to start with you, Alexei, and ask you the following question. You research post-Soviet and post-socialist contexts. The regime in Belarus has its own specifics, but maybe it's also not that unique as we sometimes think. There were protests in 2020. Lots of people left the country afterwards due to the harsh crackdown on the society by the regime. And the situation changed dramatically after this moment, so 3 years ago. But the regime itself, Alexander Lukashenko, was there from the 90s on. He won the first election in 94, and he stayed in power. So how do you see this regime developing? Where does it fit into this broader post-socialist, post-communist space?
Thanks. Well, the advantage of researching post-Soviet countries and the so-called Central Europe, the EU's new member states, is that you can compare, of course, and sometimes you find similarities that you don't expect to find, or actually, the extent of the similarities, the déjà vus are just fascinating. I think that every country is unique. In a sense, and every regime is unique, but of course you can find parallels. And the interesting thing about the regime in Belarus is probably not its static characteristics, but first of all, the fact that it evolved, that it's kind of a moving target if you try to classify it at this point, certainly. But also, if you take this, if you examine this in the broader context of the post-communist transitions, well, I like to say that there used to be a cliche. Belarus was called the last dictatorship of Europe, but that is obviously some kind of a legacy from a period when dictatorships were just expected to somehow die out. Now, speaking 30 years or so after, you could argue that this wasn't the last, but the first dictatorship in Europe, because a lot of this populist impetus that you see, obviously in the authoritarian regimes that crystallized a bit later, like the Russian one, but also in hybrid or semi-authoritarian regimes and even the democracies that are run by the so-called populist or liberal politicians. A lot of the populist impetus you could actually spot in the early Lukashenko. And that would be one point I would be making, that there's a continuity between that quick authoritarian takeover that happened in Belarus in 1995 and 1996, so basically 1 year after Lukashenko was elected. There's a continuity between that authoritarian takeover, which happened against the background of disappointment with the post-communist transition with the liberal reforms, a very quick disappointment. It took some years some more years in other places. But you can absolutely spot these features in other regimes, whether authoritarian or populist democratic. Similar narratives, similar images, similar technologies of power, if you will. So there is a continuity, let's say, from Lukashenko through Putin to people like Viktor Orban, and that is what makes that is one of the things that make the Belarusian case interesting, also in the broader context.
Thank you. Maybe let's go directly into the context in Belarus right now. Artyom, what is happening in the country today? What is the environment? Can you maybe shortly describe it and also make some, help us understand in what environment those people live? Because it seems to be quite an isolated place these days.
Yes, and just as Alexei has said, Belarusian regime is the moving target because it is increasingly hard to classify it. It was until 2020, arguably 2021, a very classic authoritarian personalist dictatorship. Right now, we are witnessing more and more traits of a neo-totalitarian Soviet-style regime, where many practices, not all of them, I emphasize not all of them, but many practices and institutions of the communist regimes, like post-Soviet, Chinese, in some cases North Korean, being introduced. And needless to say, it affects quite heavily the life of the people inside the country. First of all, again, as a disclaimer, it needs to be said that not all of the Belarusians are realizing that they live in the totalitarian, or let's say semi-totalitarian, or very highly consolidated authoritarian regime, because just as in any other society, a good chunk of the people in general don't care that much about politics, and for them not much might have changed since 2020. If you have been depoliticized, if you remain depoliticized, or if you support the government, then you probably haven't noticed that big of a change. But for the segment of the society who reads independent news, who cares about human rights, who maybe joined 2020 protests or sympathized with them, of course this is a completely different country. This is a country that feels like an internal occupation, where you actually await your government that you are that you are accustomed to treating as your government, acting as though it is a hostile foreign power that can come, whose agents can come every day to harass you, arrest you, fire you from your job because of your past disloyalty, sometimes indoctrinate your children at school, limit your rights to leave the country, limit your employment options, for example, for like a scene of giving your signature to an opposition candidate back in 2020, you might not just lose your job, but also lose the opportunity to work in the, let's say, state sector. It wouldn't be that big of a problem if Belarus would be a market economy, but unfortunately Belarus is a highly centralized government-run economy where around half of the country's GDP is generated by a state-owned enterprises. And if you are a doctor, if you are a teacher, and you are blacklisted because of your, participation in 2020 protests, where would you go? There's nowhere to work. So these things, these practices, this repressive, environment that Belarus has now become is, of course, very, very bleak picture to draw. But unfortunately, I don't have any other choice. This is now a place of suffering of thousands and thousands of people. Let alone the 1.5 thousand of internationally recognized political prisoners. If you add to these people who have already served their prison terms, people who are not known to the human rights defenders, but are in fact political prisoners, if you add to this their families that are suffering with them, Belarus has become a far more tragic place than it has been before 2020, unfortunately. And in this context, even the war that changed a lot in Eastern Europe was not such big of a turning point for the domestic situation inside the country, because all the trends that I have been describing have begun before the war. The war just accelerated. Some of them militarized the state even further, expanded the scope of repression to include anti-Russian speech. But generally speaking, Belarus has been on this sad trajectory since 2020. Obviously it triggered massive immigration. And we see now hundreds of thousands of people having left Belarus, which is a country of 9 million people, since the beginning of the protests and the beginning of this crackdown.
Do you have any estimates of how many people left?
Not really. It's impossible to know, because we have more or less reliable statistics, or let's say data in the European Union, where it's probably in between 3,500,000 people. So in the European Union, people who have left to the European Union and live primarily in two countries, Poland and Lithuania. But there are also large Belarusian diasporas now in Georgia. Needless to say, many people moved to Russia. These are not political refugees mostly, but economic migrants, you can call them, people who understand that there are no opportunities for them in Belarus, but there are some in Russia. And these numbers are simply unknown. So cumulatively, we are probably speaking about more than 500,000 of people, but these are different kinds of, diaspora groups. So to say, some of them can return, some of them cannot return. Some of them are, as would they be called in America, blue-collar workers, like truck drivers and doctors. Some of them are like classic, creative, metropolitan, urban and highly educated people. So these are a very diverse group.
Yeah. So Artem already mentioned this transition from an authoritarian regime to a totalitarian regime even. And I would like to turn to you, Alexei, and ask you about, because we know already of some totalitarian regimes that were there in the 20th century. What can we somehow compare it, or is it something else? What is the difference? I would put on the table that the technology makes a big difference. So what is the situation there?
Yeah, I think we can and we should. The term totalitarian has potentially a very broad definition, but usually we use it to refer to these classic regimes that existed in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, and then some of them survived into the second half. And some of them are still around, like North Korea. So the initial point of departure for the post-Soviet authoritarianisms, like the one in Belarus, but also Russia and elsewhere, was not really that classic Soviet totalitarianism, right? It was very different, and quite frankly, I don't think it would be possible in the 1990s to quickly build a totalitarian regime because the memory was too fresh. People were allergic to the personality cult, to what they perceived as ideological indoctrination and all other things that you are likely to find in the classical totalitarianisms. Now, my hypothesis, and this is where I'm running the risk of oversimplifying, is that the post-Soviet authoritarianisms initially were what I would call the television authoritarianisms. By that I mean that indoctrination was rather one-sided. So if you were a citizen of the USSR, then there was a comprehensive set of instruments with which the ruling class, the party, would discipline you, and it would start pretty early on, right? So you would be in the kindergarten, they would tell you about Lenin, then you would be in school, and you would become a pioneer, then you would be in the Komsomol, and there was a number of sort of repressive but also ideological institutions that would take comprehensive care of the citizen. So in the case of the post-Soviet authoritarianisms, you basically have two pillars. You have this redistribution of economic rent. So in the Russian case, this would be the oil and gas rent. And you would have a more or less monopolized media landscape, more or less, right? So we're talking TV, and we're talking first and foremost federal TV. In Belarus, this looked rather similar, right? So you had monopoly on the TV channels, but not the newspapers, right? So you had these areas of freedom where you could basically more or less publish and say whatever you wanted.
You mean now already after the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Yes, but I think that we are actually observing a very interesting historical process where this one pillar, right, of these television authoritarianisms is basically dying, right, because the TV is dying as a sort of major medium that forms this shared public space for people. And you have the rise of the internet. And, I would say that this is a very cruel way of putting it, but this is a kind of experiment with humans where these authoritarianisms have to reinvent themselves in order to face these new realities. And this is what we are observing in Belarus right now, to a lesser extent in Russia. So this is what Artyom talks about when he talks about the totalitarian tendencies in Belarus, right? So this is a neo-totalitarian form of domination. Mutatis mutandis, with all the necessary differences, if you compare that to the Soviet Union. But this is a transition from the TV authoritarianism as we knew it, as it was born and developed in the 90s.
Artyom, what kind of media are people consuming in the country today? Because we know that all independent media were banned, they don't exist in the country simply. But Alexei already mentioned there is the internet, of course, and it helps a lot. So do people really believe the propaganda that they're fed on the TV, for example?
There are different people in Belarus, and some of them do believe the propaganda that they hear on the TV news, and TV is still one of the major sources of news. It's indeed, like Alexei has said, it's decaying and it's outreach, but it's not as fast of a process. So TV probably loses like maybe 5-10 percentage points of its audience every 5 years, but it's still it's a slow trend. And still, even on the internet, for people who are predisposed to believing anti-Western, anti-liberal, pro-Russian narratives, they can find such content online. And not surprisingly, one of the more popular, let's say, political commentators among Belarusian citizens, according to independent polls, are actually Russian propagandists who also have their online presence. That's why it's a mixed picture. It's not necessarily that if you consume news from the internet that you are not brainwashed. And also there is an overlap. Many people use both internet and TV. It's hard for me to present you some current numbers because it's very hard to estimate on how many people in today's Belarus get their news from which source, because again, as you've said, it was banned. Many independent news was banned. However, they continue to work from outside of the country, and they continue to disseminate their information via social media, which are not yet banned. Social media, YouTube, are the main sources of independent information in Belarus, and sometimes the consumption on these platforms is not very conscious, where people just don't always differentiate between am I consuming news now from some independent news outlet, or it is just my friend sharing a link, or it is a blog, or what it is. So it's hard even to measure things like where do you get the news, because people just get it from their newsfeed, on the social media account, or from the messaging apps like Telegram, or their YouTube recommended section. So it's very confusing and mixed salad of information that people receive. However, the trends that we observe is that the political news, the news about politics, are getting less and less audience in Belarus since 2020. So 2020 was the peak in terms of the public politicization, and since then, not just because of the repressions and fear, but also because of the public fatigue, more and more people try to basically run away, hide from these depressing negative information, and this trend just aggravated with the war, because obviously war brought a lot more of negative, depressing stories. So I think it would be very fair to say that the majority of Belarusians, or the relative majority of Belarusians, don't follow the news that closely anymore, except for some very basic news about their, city, currency exchange rate, weather, and so on and so forth. So again, difficult, complex picture. Hard to say who has the upper hand, the propaganda or the apathy or the internet as the engine of, more or less free information.
Right. You already mentioned that the independent media didn't stop their work. they're just doing it from a different place, and oftentimes the refuge for the independent media, for oppositionally minded people, is the European Union. My question would be, what is with the EU's role, with the West's role in Belarus? What kind of standing they have there? They, of course, help a lot the opposition that is also now based in Warsaw and in Vilnius. They help the refugees from Belarus, but it seems to me that inside the country their role is rather limited, but at the same time there is some space where they could maybe do more. This would be the question.
It's very hard to invent new niches for the EU or Western influence inside Belarus, given how damaged the relations are. Because as much as everybody likes the mantra of isolating the regime but engaging with the people, it's very hard to do in the context where you have nearly closed borders, where it's very hard to travel, where you don't have any air connection, again because of the actions of the Belarusian authorities, but still where you have problems with mobility, simply speaking. Yes, the information can, Western supported, let's say, information can travel into Belarus, just as I've discussed a couple of minutes ago, but again, how many people are still interested is a big question. Having a source of information is just first step. How can you make or convince people to listen to the source? These are no longer the times of the informational hunger, like it was in the Soviet Union, for example, where people had this one radio spot in their house and they all gathered around it to listen for a free voice jammed by the Soviet KGB from some Czech Republic or broadcast from US. There is an abundance of information right now, just people are diverting away from it. I mean, sometimes it's hard to reach the audiences for this. So for this information. So speaking of the Western presence in general, in all the forms it can exist, it is very limited right now. In business, in culture, obviously in politics, trade-wise, it's very close to the Iron Curtain situation, if I'm perfectly honest with you. People still luckily can travel, and they do travel with more hardships than before, but still. But unfortunately, as a result of this whole 3 years of domestic horrors, Belarus is orienting itself more and more towards Russia. Again, culturally, economically, politically, militarily. And the EU can, of course, double down on its support for the independent media that work in the EU, from the EU soil. But to be perfectly honest, this has its limits. And until some more, complex solutions and sophisticated solutions are found, until the regional environment changes and regional crisis is resolved to the point where the erected walls can be again, shattered, I'm not sure the West has much to gain.
Right. Let me ask you, Alexei, about about this conceptualization of the regime in Belarus, of the protest movement. So, if we remember 2020, the crowd and the protest was led by one woman, and and more broadly 3 women. So 3 women from the working for different opposition candidates, united because kind of led the protest and advocated for free and fair elections. And I remember that some observers even called it a feminist revolution. I don't know how much of it holds still, but basically the question is there some sort of a gender dimension of this, of how things played out and how the regime today is in the country? There is Lukashenko, there are all his supporters, and in the authorities we mostly see men who serve there. So can you elaborate on this more?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I could give you a couple of very vivid examples of women serving that agenda. But I think, well, professional gender scholars would tell you that gender is everywhere. That everything is about gender. But I think that if we're talking about this type of authoritarian regimes, that there is a particularly fortunate moment to apply this conceptual lens to kind of try to analyze this in terms of gender and gendered images and gendered rhetoric and the role they play in mobilization and counter-mobilization. So you said that there was this female trio, or the 3 women. I mean, they were there for sure, but also their images, right? The fact that they became icons, and then they stimulated the sort of production of many more gendered icons. So there was a whole kind of visual rhetoric out there that played a very important role. Why is that important? Well, I would maybe refer to a study we did comparing Belarus and Egypt, and the role that gender played in the respective protest mobilizations. And that sounds counterintuitive, because how can you compare a country from Eastern Europe, the post-Soviet area, and a country from the Middle East when they seem to be so different, and they are. But there is a concept that has to do with classifying authoritarian regimes, and that can be taken beyond the region, right? It can open you, sort of the path to cross-regional comparisons. So they sometimes classify certain type of authoritarian regimes as sultanistic, and that by implication that means that not only is it a very personalist regime, sort of a regime that is centered around one individual, and a regime that lacks clear institutions that would be the pillars of this regime, and a clear ideology. I mean, there are attempts to invent these ideologies, but they usually amount to nothing. And I think, as you're listening to this, you can clearly recognize the Belarusian authoritarian regime in this, right? So very personalist, centered around the leader, and lacking a distinct ideology, right? Something that can be codified and printed as a book. Well, I mean, one sort of hypothesis that we make in our study, and we find confirmation for that hypothesis, is that the gender and various types of gendered othering, so sexism, homophobia, and other types of othering or enemy image building, is something that fills into this ideological vacuum. It substitutes for functional ideology. And because these are sometimes very strong feelings of hatred, right, of fear, that is something that these regimes can actually use to mobilize their supporters, and it kind of fills in for the lack of a genuine ideology.
Yeah, we already mentioned the war in Ukraine, and I want to expand on this a little bit longer. Artyom, so Belarus basically chose a side, or Belarusian regime chose a side in this war, willingly or not, but they are supporting Russia, stationing their nuclear weapons on Belarusian territory, providing the territory in the early days for the attacks, training the soldiers, and other things. So what would a potential post-war order mean for Belarus? We don't know what the outcome of the war is, but let's say roughly, it's probably going to be more fuzzy than that, but roughly there is more or less a clear victory for Ukraine, and the other scenario would be less clear victory for Ukraine. What kind of visions, what do you envision in these two scenarios?
There is such a huge difference for Belarus between these two scenarios, because what matters for Belarus is not necessarily what matters directly for Belarus is not the degree of Ukraine's freedom and its clarity for everybody in the world, but the repercussions of this victory onto Russia. Because Belarus here will feel the indirect impact of this colossal event, which will be the end of this war, via the changes in Russia. And then we have to ask a question: will this end to the war bring any kind of changes to Russia? And I'm not speaking just democratization of Russia. I would be too ambitious in my dreams to hope for a swift democratization of Russia. But will this war weaken Russia to the point where Russia is either no longer able or no longer willing to support Lukashenko regime? Or will it not? Because I can imagine this war ending in a very defeat-like situation for Moscow, where Moscow failed to achieve any objectives, and even lost more ground than it held before February 2022. But still possessing enough political, military, and economic might to control at least Belarus. And this scenario would not mean much changes to Belarus, unfortunately, because of course Ukraine will be sort of victorious, but Belarusians and Belarus, unfortunately, will still have to sustain the same imposed dominance of Moscow. So in a way this is a difference between whether the predator is wounded or dead, right? The wounded predator sometimes is even more dangerous. So if we imagine the Putin regime surviving this war, but losing it to a degree, it might create more dangers for Belarus, because it might become even more revisionist, even more aggressive towards remaining, sphere of influence it has, trying to maybe use Belarus or present Belarus to its hardliners and hawkish part of the population as the compensation for the losses in Ukraine. So this opened the whole,
So basically it would mean merger with Russia or something like this.
At least an attempt to coerce Belarus into deeper integration. And I'm not certain that Lukashenko, for all his sins and misgivings, I'm not sure that he will willingly agree. I would expect some resistance from Minsk, even from the current pro-Russian regime in Minsk. Because again, no country, in my knowledge of the recent history, has just abandoned its sovereignty. So it's not that easy to imagine, voluntarily, I mean. Now, when we speak of the Ukrainian victory, complete Ukrainian victory scenario that triggers either regime change in Russia or a complete regime weakening in Russia, then I think we are far more likely to see something similar to the Eastern European emancipation from the Soviet rule or liberation from the Soviet rule. It may come in the form of another destabilization of the Belarusian regime, or it may come in the form of Belarusian regime being just forced by these hardships to organize some kind of a transition, where Lukashenko simply realizing that the game is over for him and his regime, he gives power to some of his subordinates, but with maybe less totalitarian face, and the regime might slowly get rid of the Russian grip. Because this is also conceivable, given that Soviet Union, when it's lost the war in Afghanistan and basically lost the competition in the Cold War, as much as many people in Moscow would like to, it just wasn't able to control its allies that were trying to run away. And so you see there are a spectrum of options for Belarus as a result of this war, and therefore it's very hard to preclude, any of them and to judge which one is more likely. But in any way, the end of this war has I mean, it is the most likely driver of change in Belarus, to be perfectly honest, because if we observe the current equilibrium in the Belarus-Russia relations continuing indefinitely or for a very long time, the Belarusian regime, I think, is pretty much secure. So this equilibrium of Moscow-Minsk honeymoon needs to change for changes in Belarus to become possible.
We're running out of time, so I would like to address one last question to Alexei. Very broad question, but try to be brief on that. We already spoke a bit about this, about Belarus moving into cultural space of Russia or being even more integrated into it. What does it mean for the Belarusian identity? Because we know during the Soviet Union there was this pan-Soviet identity, and the Belarusian identity was also somehow suppressed, I would say, or not like that, you know, in the public space. During the period of independence, it somehow rose, but now again it seems to be maybe on the downside in the country, but on the outside of the country it's promoted. So the question would be, how can we preserve it so that when the time is right, we can bring it back home?
Okay, so
very idealistic.
$1,000,000 question.
And big, yeah, I know.
And very little time to answer. Well, I think, just, you know, to be a bit obnoxious, I don't think there was a period in history when Belarusian identity was not oppressed.
Not suppressed, I know.
Right, so it's always against all odds. So that, you know, that gives you some hope. But I think that, of course, it depends also on what you mean by identity. If these are specific things like language and culture, then I think the recipe is quite straightforward. I mean, you need to invest into creating more content in Belarusian, in particular, online content. You need to seek international Western support for Belarusian culture. You need to explain that this is an important factor, also politically speaking. And I think we have the advantage of having the new media, we have the advantage of having the internet. This is something that people didn't have in the 1970s, you know, let alone the 19th century. And there's a lot of grassroots things going on. And
if I may add also Belarusian schools in the place of the concentration of diaspora, because this is also a big problem, that the next generation gets sort of integrated into the new societies fully. Like they go to the local schools and they are not anymore associating themselves with Belarusian.
Yeah. So I think that should be part of the agenda. I mean, specific practical steps, they will help more than you know, abstract discussions about identity. Well, you can save that for the ivory tower.
All right, that was an unexpectedly brief answer. Thank you so much. It was a very interesting debate. I thank you both. And to our listeners and viewers, I would like to thank you for your time, and please subscribe to our channels and follow us on social media. Bye-bye.